We're the victims, you're the oppressors. You use the machinery of the institutions to keep us down. All the evils and the wrongs of the world can be resumed in the fact of your dominance. So it all sounds like class politics, or at least a certain form of populist politics, but it might be polarized on gender lines, on generational lines, on cultural lines, on various other things. And none of it actually provides a solution, but just deepens you in your own resentment of the world.
We are being invited to understand and explain our problems through gendered terms. It's just another way of kind of deflecting attention from class and so on. As you mentioned, like generations is another one. When I was kind of joking or making fun of people for putting pronouns in their bios and this kind of thing, I'm not kind of saying it's their fault for doing this. You are kind of socialized into a role that, if you can play it well, will serve you. You have these kind of downwardly mobile or precarious professionals who are trying to distinguish themselves from the working class, or trying to say, like, I don't belong down there in the people to be managed. I am a manager. And here I will show you that I have the cultural capital to be in the managerial class, to be the manager, or at least to not get tossed down into the working class. And I will perform that by taking on all of this language that has become very gendered. And it has become gendered because for a long time, the institutions have begun to place an emphasis on the female subject. So to fit into these institutions, you have to say, like, look, I'm going to play out this stereotypical feminine. And the problematic subject becomes the old masculine subject, which had been the powerful subject in the past, but now that has to be quelled. And now you have to kind of say, like, I distinguish myself from this unruly, problematic masculine subject. I am, like, empathetic. I am rule following. I am moral. I am good. I'm unproblematic. I am capable of rising above.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast. I'm Alex Hokuli in São Paulo, Brazil, joined today by a boy and a girl, which is fitting. Hello to George Hoare in London.
Hey, I'm assuming I'm the boy. But we'll see who's the guest.
And the guest is a girl, Ashley Frawley, joining us from Greece. Hello, Ashley. Welcome back.
Hello. It's been a long time since I've been called a girl, but I like it. It's got a good ring to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we just did this boy and girl thing, so whatever. Which is what we are talking about this today. For those who don't know Ashley, and for some reason haven't heard her on BungaCast before, she's a sociologist and senior editor at Compact. Now, today we're talking about the way that politics has become gendered. And politics is gendered today, but not in the way that feminists or queer theorists argue. Political polarization today increasingly has gendered hues. So, the radical right is explicitly masculinist, macho, whereas the liberal center is feminine coded. One side wants to castrate you. The other side uses politics as a vehicle for aggressive impulses. For those of us whose formative years were the 1990s and 2000s, as it is for the three of us here, this is kind of strange. At least that's my feeling on this. Sex or gender became less relevant as we approached parity in most realms, in economics and social status, even in the bedroom. At least that was my read on things growing up. Now there's this gendered political polarization and even growing dissensus or conflict between the sexes. And it's not just about politics or economics, but it's also about romance and sex and dating and lots of other things besides. One of the ways this is explained nowadays, one of the prevalent narratives, is that men have radicalized rightwards. But there's evidence that it might be the other way around. A recent issue of Britain's new Statesman magazine, which came out last month, was dedicated to exploring survey data that it had commissioned that shows that young women have radicalized. So this is what we're going to be discussing today. But before we get into it, I just wanted to make some quick comments. Firstly, there's a lack of independent measures in this discussion. So when we say that women have moved left, that's maybe question begging, because we have to inquire into the changing meanings of left and right. You regular
Taking the words out of my mouth.
Very aware of that. Yeah. And perhaps, being left-wing means voting for parties like the US Democrats or UK Labour. But, are these left-wing parties? And then similarly, being right-wing may be associated with caring about certain issues. I don't know, whatever, immigration, for example, which previously didn't have a clear left-right coding and now does. So it's quite hard to say, well, women have moved in such a direction, men have moved in this other direction, because the things that we're comparing them to themselves have shifted. So it's quite hard to explain social phenomena via politics. Now, we discussed a lot of these matters on a previous episode on gender polarization, Girls Left, Boys Right with Nina Power from early 2024. Check it out. It's linked in the show notes. But secondly, I just wanted to say that we should root this discussion of polarization in attitudes and values in the changing gender gap. So if we take US and UK voting behavior as our reference points, and of course there's limitations to that, but we can say that there was little gender gap in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as men and women voted pretty similarly. Actually, women tended to be a bit more conservative. From the 1970s on, women began to shift leftwards, which is associated to greater labor force participation in education, as well as the salience of issues like reproductive rights, equal pay, and so on. But already there's a shifting meaning in perhaps what left and right meant. In the 1990s and 2000s, this gender gap, from my understanding, stabilized or even decreased. Women remained a little bit more supportive of welfare spending and public services, while men were slightly more market-oriented and conservative on things like taxation or defense. But actually, most of this variation can be explained by other variables like class, education, and age, and so on. So, this gender gap, and indeed probably even sexual or gender conflict, was less back in the 90s and 2000s. In the past decade or so, we've seen this renewed divergence, which has occurred especially among the young. So young women are becoming much more progressive, while the picture with young men is actually a little bit less clear. At least this is what the UK data seems to show. Men are either staying where they were, or they're becoming a bit more conservative, or they're becoming more anti-progressive, which might be a slightly different thing. That is to say, they're reacting against a sort of dominant feminism. So with that historical narrative in mind, it's hard not to associate the new gender gap and the gender politics with the end of history and the return of politics. What I think we don't have a good explanation for, and maybe we'll try to get a little bit closer to it today, is why social dislocation and political frustration has taken the form of gender politics, particularly among the young. Why has this happened when everything seemed to be going so well on the gender front? At least when I was growing up, when George was growing up, when Ashley was growing up. I don't know if they agree with this picture that I've painted of the 90s and 2000s. Maybe we'll start there.
Everything was fine in the 90s and 2000s.
Everything was great.
No, one bit of context I would add in there, and you did kind of mention it a little bit, is that I think there has been a definite moral panic about young boys. Like there's something wrong with young boys. They are they are in the manosphere and they are extreme. And there's there is a real there is something that needs to be done about these boys, and that I think is a little bit different to the 90s and 2000s, and that's probably something which happened from the maybe the 2010s onwards, was that starting to think that at least one of the genders that is in a really bad position. And
how many genders are there?
Well, that's a whole nother podcast discussion, but I said at least one as at least boys, maybe girls as well. But I think it's the problem, or the discourse definitely started with young boys and their kind of their extremism. But I think one of the things we should discuss is
young men. I assume you mean, not young boys. I mean, we're talking about teenagers and young adults. Yeah.
Well, I guess as as you get older, what counts as a young man and as a boy is like ages with you. So yeah, maybe we should just use like age terms rather than these kind of very fuzzy ones. But anyway, no, I just wanted to add that in because I think it's an important bit of the scene setting.
Ashley, I mean, was that your recollection as well? The 90s and 2000s? I mean, have you sensed this change yourself?
Yeah, I will complicate this in a moment, but I mean, just from my own experience, I remember, it was like whatever a boy can do, a girl can do. There's really nothing that's going to hold you back. I do recall, though, that motherhood was really denigrated. I don't know. I was like a little sponge for stupid things in the cultural sphere. And I kind of remember saying to a teacher once, like, oh, but I don't want to grow up to be just a mother, which was interesting because this is a literal exact quote from one of the respondents in that in one of those New Statesman pieces, where she said, I don't want to be just a mother. And I thought, oh my gosh, I said that when I was like 10 years old, and my teacher got very annoyed with me and tried to explain that actually mothers do a lot. It's pretty horrible, but yeah. So I mean, I think these things, there have been tensions that perhaps that were not so much explicitly referred to, but were already growing in the 90s. But yeah, I did find generally that my experience was that really gender seemed to matter less and less. And I was really shocked and surprised to see suddenly, it seemed to me over the past decade, and we won't really go into depth in this, but just to say how much people began to see gendered stereotypes as significant and defining of identity in relation to the trans issue. I just found it the most bizarre thing. And I think a lot of millennials were probably looking at that going, where on earth is this coming from? But I don't know if that's just an artifact of maybe there were some parts in the United States that maintained these kinds of rigid gender roles, and the United States has a tendency to kind of lead culture and dictate the public agenda, even if it doesn't make sense in other places. I don't know if that's what was going on, but it was, gender mattered so little to me growing up that I was shocked to hear people talking like that. To hear that you might want to, change your physical body to match your preferred gender, which I'm sorry, I can't see how is different from gendered stereotypes or the idea of what a woman or a man is supposed to be and how it's supposed to present in the world. I just found that so bizarre. But as I said, I would kind of complicate that because you can see, I think that politics and institutions were becoming more and more gendered long before people followed. And by that, I mean, in international development literature, you could see a shift toward a preference for the female subject. For, you can see like Amartya Sen would say, instead of using the generic he, blah, 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 talking about a generic person, he starts saying she. And the reason for this isn't just that everybody was doing this because it's more politically correct, but he really did mean like the ideal subject of global governance is shifting toward the female, the woman. The woman is more trustworthy. We should really focus our attention in terms of our policies and our interventions on the woman, because if you give men in the global south money, they'll just go gamble and spend it and be violent or whatever, and they'll drink, but women will be responsible, this sort of thing. So the kind of stereotypical feminine became the preferred subject in all sorts, that's just one example, but in all sorts of different institutions in society. And you can see it, for instance, in like health policy. They're, going back to the 90s, sociologists started asking, is there a gendered aspect to public health now? Are we, for such a long time, the feminine was denigrated. If you look at like Enlightenment discourses, it was like the feminine is to be dominated and mastered, like nature is feminine and needs to be mastered. She's to be mastered by the man who will hold her down and make her reveal her secrets, kind of thing. And it really starts to shift going into, with the rise of public health, and health promotion. It's like, all that stuff that we used to say was really bad about women that made them unsuitable for public life. Actually, all that is great. It's so good that you're body conscious. It's so good that you're health conscious, and that you're the guardians of health and morality and so on. That's fantastic. Ladies, I know feminists were fighting against this for a really long time and said it was really limiting, but no, it's actually great. You should be more like that. And men too should take up that feminized subjectivity. So I think institutions kind of were shifting in that direction. So I just gave two examples, international development, but you've probably heard like feminization of education. These sorts of arguments were also being raised quite early on.
Yeah, even the prevalence of human resources management in corporations as well, which is itself kind of feminine coded ways of managing conflict through discussion, consensus, etc. So I mean that also gets kind of female coded, and indeed perhaps breeds some of the reaction, the kind of masculinist reaction that we see today as well. Now we're basing a lot of this on the we're using kind of as a plank for this discussion the New Statesman piece, which the headline, actually not just the piece, but that issue is Angry Young Women. And going to delve into a little bit of the data that they present, as well as rely maybe occasionally on some of the reporting, because there is some interesting sort of vox pops and focus groups or I don't know, discussions and some reporting that they do in those pieces, which are revelatory if indeed we want to put store in them. Firstly is just the views of the opposite sex. So women, young women, especially those under 25, see men exceptionally negatively. So only about a third see men positively, and another third see them negatively. Another third neutral. So that's not especially positive when you put it into or put it alongside the fact that nearly 3/4 of men under 30 see women positively. So that on the one hand runs counter to, I think, a lot of the claims about misogyny, right? That men hate women. And as an aside, one of my pet peeves today is the fact that no one seems to distinguish anymore between sexism and misogyny, when in fact they're quite different. I mean, a sexist might love women or like women, but just has double standards with regard to them. Whereas the misogynist hates women. These are not the same thing. People treat them as the same. And I think that's kind of this part of a general kind of rhetorical amplification as a way of kind of making big claims and whatever. But anyway, back to the data. Why what's your read on it? Why this lack of mutual understanding or goodwill when men and women have never been more equal?
Well, there's a few different explanations, aren't there? One is that young men are bad, and that young women are correct in seeing them negatively. The other is that young women's expectations are either they're mean and they're just critical, or that their expectations are too high. I think the reason why I would kind of point to
well, and indeed that they might be right? That men are aggressive and uncaring, and that women are concerned about justice, and we live in an obviously unjust world, and therefore,
but
they're in some ways correct, even if they're ideological in some ways in their way of seeing it in a gendered way.
But I think that the fundamental in point of interest in the survey is that there is this split. And in fact, I would say more widely, I mean, obviously Angry Young Women is a good headline, but it seems like the wider picture is about, I don't want to say disappointed, not angry, but disappointed, but the negativity across a whole vast swathes of life and the future. I don't think it's a set of attitudes which is just about misandry or sexism. I think it's actually about a fundamental kind of disconnect between expectations of particularly the future and reality. And I think that is what really struck me was I mean, this is one survey, you can't generalize from it, but it does seem like if there is a kind of nascent cultural atmosphere of pessimism or of doomerism, I'm not going to try and get too much into the kind of words and terms that the youth would use, because I will just embarrass myself. But yeah, it just seems like whatever, like women or young women seem to be really picking up on this kind of this deep cultural pessimism and reflecting it through the attitudes, at least in this survey. So I think it doesn't seem to be just limited to negativity towards men or towards young men. In fact, it's like, everything's fucked in their opinion.
Yeah. I mean, maybe everything is fucked, but it's interesting that they express it more clearly than some other cohorts do. And I guess that's what's interesting, and maybe can ask why that is. I mean, just on before we move on to some of the more political stuff, the negative attitudes that women hold towards men. I mean, because there's a conservative conclusion that we can draw that we were only happy, things were only at peace when one sex exerted its supremacy over another, and that's how. And there's also people who argue that today, in fact. And how do we avoid that? Because there does seem to be at least a correlative aspect to this, which is that as equality has grown between the sexes, discontent between the sexes has also increased, and that's perhaps a paradox that needs explaining.
I've started to wonder whether a lot of this is a lot of the talk about misandry and misogyny is actually a veiled misanthropy. Because Okay, so it seems to me that what
Hmm.
we've been seeing for a while is the construction of men as a problem. You've had like rape culture, men rule the world, patriarchy, all of these sorts of ideas floating around in the culture. And then it comes down to individual men, that individual men are not doing enough. They are not concerned enough about particular causes. They're not empathetic enough. They're not this, they're not that. So when you construct men as a problem, you also implicitly construct a kind of woman as an ideal. And therefore, a kind of woman who doesn't live up to that ideal also as a problem. So you can see, I think, some of this in cancel culture, where a lot of the time it was women, particularly around the trans issue, that were really made to pay, like really made to pay, because they were not, they were sort of doubly deviant. You know, one, they were breaking the rule that you were supposed to say just these 5 things: trans women are women, blah, blah, blah. You're supposed to just say the mantras and just be kind. So they broke that rule. It was for everybody. But then they broke another one, which was that you're supposed to, as a woman, be accommodating and empathetic. And so it's because a lot of what previous kinds of problematizations of women and like the location of women at the heart of social problems was around you know, I mean, it was women. It was women's like wombs. It was like women as mothers, women failing as mothers. They're the ones who are the problems, and it's kind of shifted. But I don't think we've actually like thrown off that old problematization of the woman. I think it's just like a kind of democratization of the hatred to from women also to men. So it's like, you know, women, you know, back in like the 50s, the unwed mother, or the 40s or whatever, like historically it was the unwed mother as opposed to the teen mother that was supposedly the source of all these problems. And over time we've kind of heaped more and more responsibility onto women for as the cause and solution to all social problems. So like, where are the parents? Where are the parents? And they used to say, where are the mothers? Mothers ought to do blah blah blah, but they can't say that anymore. They can't say it, so they'll say parents. So the solution. So what has actually been happening in terms of how policymakers and so on, and the claims makers in the public sphere construct social problems, is they've been heaping all this responsibility implicitly onto women via the narrative of parenting. But now they kind of mean it. And now it's like, what is the solution to the woman taking the second shift when she gets home? Men too should do that. Men too should be be intensive fathers. So the answer to the burden of intensive motherhood became intensive fatherhood. And women are like mad because they're not saying, hey, there's too much on women. They're saying there's not enough on men. So I think we're not doing enough to kind of like push off this individualization of social problems that comes through just this one example of parenting. Instead, we're sort of like democratizing it. No, actually, it's the men. They're not doing enough. You know, you're still responsible for everything. It's not social structure. It's not the economy. It's not this. It's not that. Or it might be like in some like far off kind of sense of like the Epstein class, like not really well thought through. But at the end of the day, it's you. You have this responsibility. Yeah. And actually, it's like implicitly, it's women, you have the responsibility to be intensive workers, intensive mothers, and be aware of all of the social injustice that is going on in the world, because you are an empathetic being. That is what you're supposed to be. And women, they're not wrong when they feel like this is an injustice, but they're like, fuck you, men. Why aren't you like taking up this burden that's been put on me? As opposed to being like, hey, like actually we're just completely misunderstanding. It's not like something defective within the human spirit, be it like gendered male or female, but a complete misunderstanding, a backward understanding of why things go wrong in the world.
I wonder if it's connected to what you were just saying, this kind of the construction of men as the problem. And then is it the case that I think this is a term that you might have used, but correct me if I'm wrong, the kind of social problems class, so the kind of NGO workers and such like, that's a kind of female coded person perhaps. So I'm just sort of hearing you talk made me think it's gone from kind of where are the parents to now where is the social worker. And the social worker is there are obviously male social workers, but that kind of the caring arm of the state or extension of the state through NGOs. That I'm just sort of hearing you talk just made me think that, yeah, there is some kind of social expectation perhaps that the people who will solve the problems which escape the individual's control at a point are tend to be women, or tend to have that expectation that it will be women who have to take up, whatever politics is, which today maybe has been boiled down to caring about things. So there is this kind of social expectation perhaps of the female coded social problem class to come along and solve these issues.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
also
I mean,
an implicit. Yeah, sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I was just going to say, because I mean, it does seem to be a facet of the kind of general culture war in which everyone hates everyone. And one thing that I had missed out of that sort of explanation is this notion of responsibilization that Ashley just mentioned. I think it is important because we are overburdened with responsibilities for social outcomes, responsibilities for the way the world is, responsibilities for taking care of basically anything within that is potentially within our remit and even beyond that. And when you're overloaded with responsibilities by the prevailing order, I think there's a tendency to try to shove them on to someone else, or at least through an act of negative solidarity, say, well, you too need to be overburdened just like I am, right? So if someone's demanding higher wages, you go, well, no, but I'm having to struggle here. You should be struggling too, right? And I wonder if there isn't an aspect of negative solidarity that at play here between the genders as well. One thing which I found interesting in one of the kind of semi-critical discussions, I think it was in the Critic magazine, which responded to this New Statesman issue. Just a quote from it. He says, "I might be able to bridge a gap on one issue in a conversation, that is a gap between the way men and women see things. But there is a mythology firmly based around being kind, which feeds through everything. On divisive issues like immigration, you have to justify that you are not innately evil. So whatever position you take, here I'm interpreting, so whatever position you take, you need to kind of justify it by reference to your own good intentions, right? I'm not a bad guy. Like, for example, I might be in favor of immigration controls, but it's not because I'm racist and fundamentally evil, but it's because such and such reasoning, right? And I think that need to justify speaks to the wider kind of culture war scenario as a feature of hyper politics when everyone hates everyone, right? That it's your neighbor who fundamentally is the enemy, and your neighbor might be a woman, you're a man, vice versa. It might be someone of a different political inflection or different values, but ultimately it comes down to a kind of form of social polarization which impedes the possibility for solidarity, across people who might fundamentally have similar interests, similar concerns. And that seems to me maybe that's too kind of zooming out a little bit too far for the kind of still the start of this discussion. But it did seem to strike me as a relevant factor. And this comes through in the reporting as well, right? So there's a lot of young women. So this is the reporting that, in the New Statesman that I'm referring to. But the lack of mutual understanding plays out in attitudinal and value differences. So young women say they could never be with someone, go out with someone, be romantically attached to someone with different views. But the examples they give, are views on Donald Trump or Israel-Palestine, neither of which are life and death issues for young British people. These are not issues over which there would even be necessary implications on terms of how you may act, really. And I don't mean to kind of minimize someone's politics, but
no, it's
it does seem to me that it's kind of culture war stuff.
Well, I guess the question is like, we should have maybe introduced or put this against the pre-political theme that we have as part of this year's at least Breeding Club, but also other episodes. And it's like, is this a kind of, are these pre-political or are these political attitudes? Because a lot of them do seem to be kind of consumption behaviors, but maybe that is what politics is like, or politics is understood to be increasingly by young people. And if that is the case, then it's not young people's fault, it's all of our fault, that we've essentially said, politics as lifestyle, this is something which should be it should be important enough that you choose your romantic partner based on political issues in other parts of the world, and even choosing your partner based on political issues in in modern Britain, when it's not like we have a communist party with hundreds of thousands of people and you have to be in that communist party and that's your whole life, or same with the Conservative Party, whatever. It's not really that structure of that society isn't really structured it in that way. So it does already seem to be a fairly weighty personal decision that's being taken on account of things which may not translate into voting behavior, political participation of sorts beyond the kind of more, although protests aren't mentioned in the reportage, but beyond more kind of social media based things. Anyway, I just thought like a little bit of is this pre-politics? Is this post-politics? Is it politics or hyper-politics? There's a lot of
and
options.
just to add to that, it's often gets things very confused if you start trying to explain the social via the political, right? So like there might be a social phenomenon going on where women and men hate each other, right? But to say, okay, this is because ultimately they have different politics because they have different views on Donald Trump or something, like you might miss a lot of what is going on there in terms of, important things like the personalization of politics, right? Like as if your views on the American president, by the way, different country, that it is a fundamental attribute of your personhood.
Well, once a colony, always a colony. We have to take.
Well, once a colonizer, now a colony. Hello, friend. You've reached the end of the free part of the episode. Well, we put out 2 entirely free episodes a month. The rest is for subscribers. For access, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Lee Jones, Amberly Frost, Catherine Liu, Alex Gurevich, Ryan Zickgraf, and Lee Phillips, as well as a huge number of guests. In 2026, our priorities are to explore the following themes: emerging state capitalism, war and militarism, political recombinations and new revolts, irrationalism and unfreedom and how to challenge these ideas, and the pre-political, or the social bases on which politics may be built. We'll also be exploring these themes through the BungaCast Reading Club, through a selection of classic essays, book chapters, films, and academic articles. If you sense history accelerating but feel that we have no control over events, then join us as we try to find political clarity to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.